Before I begin the formalities, allow me to tell you a little anecdote. I work on Ibn Hamdis al-Saqili, who comes from a Sfaxian family way back, as you all know. And he is the great poet who lived 80 years of his life talking about Sicily and being proud of Sicily. But of course, he's a Tunisian Sfaxian, as we know. And early in his life, he wrote a poem. It was something like a khamriya, in which he describes a scene in which he leaves in the suburbs of Syracuse, where he was born and raised. He went with his friends after a day of hunting, after a tardiya. So the poem is something between a tardiya and a khamriya, where he knocks on the door of a monastery, of a convent, where there are two nuns. And they come out, and he and his friends, after the hunt, decide to buy some wine from the sisters, from the nuns. And there's a line in the poem in which he put his silver on the tray, and they poured forth with their jugs of gold. And out of the jugs ran a very rich kahwa. And I was very excited, and I said to myself, you know, I wonder if my colleague, who's the world expert on the history of coffee, knows that the Sicilians knew about kahwa during this time, but it wasn't the different kahwa. Thank you. I learned later that it wasn't the same thing. But anyway, on the occasion of kahwa this evening, I thought I would give this anecdote. Marhaban bikum, yusaduni an urahib bikum هذه الليلة. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Cemal Kafadar, who is our Vehbi Koç Professor of Turkish Studies. Professor Kafadar is also one of the world-leading experts of Ottoman history. Before I mention some of the things that he's written, I would say that like Malik ibn Anas and Ash-Shafi'i, he is the father of a madhab in which many, many students have graduated from Harvard University. And like the sohbah of the medieval madhab, they are dispersed all over the world. So wherever you go in the United States or Europe, you're always going to find a sahib of Cemal Kafadar. So he's bringing his sohbah here to Tunis finally, and we're very happy to have him here today. Professor Kafadar is interested in the social and cultural history of the Middle East. His time period ranges far and wide. In addition to being somebody who is an expert on early Ottoman, he also works on late Ottoman, but his time period is quite large. And his geography goes well beyond what we think of as the Ottoman Empire. Several years ago, by way of a illustration of his breadth, his tefennun, he, on the eve of Halloween, gave a 2-hour lecture on the history of vampires and how vampirism was part of Turkey, and it moved into Western Europe all the way to Britain and to the United States. So his historical perspective and his historical interest is not only temporarily and spatially wide, it's also disciplinary and culturally wide. In 1993, he published Suleiman II and His Times. In 1995, his groundbreaking Between Two Worlds, The Construction of the Ottoman State. And also, he has an article that has been something of a textbook article for most students of Middle Eastern Studies, The Question of Ottoman Decline, that was published in 1999. In addition to his courses on Ottoman history, he works on urban space, travel, popular culture, history, and if that weren't enough, he's a big, big film buff. And there probably isn't a film that he hasn't seen, and he could give lectures on films as well. So he is very interesting. One of my favorite articles that he has, and this is going to take about 15 minutes to talk about the title, just to mention the title, but here it goes. How dark is the history of the night? How black the story of coffee? How bitter the tale of love? And then colon, the changing measure of leisure and pleasure in early modern Istanbul. So with that title, I want to turn over the microphone to Professor Cemal Kafadar and welcome here to Tunis. This is his maiden voyage to Tunis, but he and Professor Najib Olu will have promised to come back, so you hopefully in the near future you'll be seeing a lot more of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for this warm introduction. Thank you all for being here. Good. I worried for a minute. I haven't done any testing of the system, but it's easy enough. Siham is always prepared anyway. I wanted to start with a quote from Fernand Braudel, as everyone here knows, the great historian, French historian of the 20th century, and a towering figure for historians since the 1950s, at least. He says about the history of coffee, there is a danger that the history of coffee may lead us astray. The anecdotal, the picturesque, and the unreliable play an enormous part in it. He's quite right, of course. But there is the other danger that because it lends itself to the picturesque and the cute or the frivolous, the subject of coffee and of its consumption as a social beverage risks not being taken seriously. Coffee, for my research interests, is one of the ultimate symbols and realities of much that we associate with modernity, or with our everyday lives that have been and are being transformed by forces and processes that we sometimes call modernity, that we associate with a new age, anyway, beginning at some point in the 15th century. Forces and processes, what kinds of things? A quickening tempo of life, doing much more at night, changing the nature of our daily rhythms and thereby rearranging the architecture of day and night, recreational use of mind and mood-altering substances, new conceptions of and practices regarding labor and leisure, etc., etc. Coffee is part of this, flows in the veins of these types of forces and processes that are recognizable from the 15th century onwards, with a different pace in different parts of the world, appearing at different moments in different parts of the world maybe. But the kinds of things I've listed here, and I could list more, are probably all recognizable to you. Balzac, I was going to also quote, I didn't plan to be the giving quotations from French writers as such, but it just so happens Balzac also is very well known in terms of his indulgence in coffee, and eventually maybe also losing his life because of his overconsumption of coffee. And he thought that caffeine caused ideas to quick march into motion. This is the kind of quickness, tempo that we associate with certain aspects, but very important aspects of what we call modernity. Modern and modernity, these are words that many in the Western world like to claim exclusive ownership of, and sometimes to invoke modernity when speaking of the Arab or the Ottoman world before the 19th century seems like appealing for acceptance to or inclusion in an otherwise exclusivist club, the world of modernity. And that's clearly not my purpose. And when I do use the word early modern, which is now an ordinary usage among Ottomanists, and I think for good reasons, I would defend it, but you can in your own minds translate it or change it into Neuzeit, if that makes you happier, because the word modern is not in it, and it happens to belong to a particular cultural configuration. That is not the case with regard to the notion of modernity for me, and that there is a new age as of the 15th century is clear enough. The name that we give to it is ultimately secondary to me, though I personally like to use for its analytical punch the notion of modernity and early modern for the reasons, for the kinds of things that I just outlined, the quickening tempo, the changing rhythm of day and night, etc., etc. Now, in other words, one of the most significant aspects of modernity as a historical and experiential circumstance for me is the eagerness, or at least readiness, to manipulate one's tempo and mood through the use of various substances like herbs and concoctions, to the rush to get a rush, the temptation to possess a thermostat controlling one's ups and downs. The long and convoluted history of this sense of modernity, or Neuzeit, cannot be understood without taking note of certain developments which are centered in certain parts of the Middle East and North Africa in that early modern period. Just like chocolate, coca, sugar, tea, whose stories have different centers of gravity, coffee has taken an important part in the rise of modernity in the above-mentioned sense, and its story cannot be told without a deep excursion into the social and cultural life of early modern Istanbul, Cairo, Aleppo, Tunis, and other cities of this well-connected region. At the same time, but before I move to the institution as such, this from an Italian advertisement of the 1930s as one of the greatest signs of Italian modernity, the invention of the espresso machine, which now looks so much less than a machine compared to the kinds of objects that we play with. But this wonderful invention that I'm sure you all recognize was at some point an invention that hailed the modernity of Mussolini's Italy because, among other things, you could serve coffee with it, yes, but it was made of aluminum. The coming together of aluminum, you know what I mean, and coffee was that particular moment of pride in Italian modernity. Coffee, we recognize, if I just show you this picture from the 20th century, would clearly be recognizable as something that people at that time in Europe associated with modernity. But of course, to get there, you have a long history centered in the space, in the geography that I just mentioned. As Marshall Hodgson points out, the phenomenon of fascination with and popular recreational use of mind or mood molding substances was of special import for the growth of a human personality in the Islamic world of the post-Mongol era. The big difference here is that instead of ritualistic uses of these mind and or mood molding substances, people moved more and more toward recreational uses thereof, which is more characteristic of our age. And coffee and tobacco doesn't anymore seem harmless, but they all have some addictive qualities, and they have always been associated with some change in our mood, at least, if not in our mental states. The eventual emergence of a coffee, tea, or chocolate-consuming public with dedicated social institutions called coffee houses. This is one of the earliest pictures of a coffee house, and I'll show you details. This from just the end of the 16th century, from an album that is now in Chester Beatty in Dublin, Chester Beatty Library in London. The eventual emergence of a coffee, tea, or chocolate-consuming public with dedicated social institutions cannot be considered independently of that turn from ritualistic to recreational uses of certain substances to change our everyday lives, its rhythms, its moods, etc. The origins and early proliferation of these institutions can be located between Cairo and Istanbul from the early to the mid-16th century, and their unfolding story thereafter as one of the most significant sites where new modes of sociability and engagement with public culture were shaped can be traced as a global phenomenon. By the end of the 16th century, they were ubiquitous in the cities of the Ottoman realm and familiar in Iran, where they would multiply within the next few decades. By the end of the 17th century, European cities were following suit. The emergence and spread of coffee houses in these cities beginning with Cairo, Aleppo, Istanbul, etc., coincided with various other dynamics and processes of the early modern era, three of which are most important to underline for my purposes. One, new levels and forms of urbanization accompanying the rise of a bourgeoisie in the generic sense of city folk. The 16th century was a moment also of great demographic boom all around the Mediterranean and other parts of the world, and much of that demographic boom reflected also, for various reasons I cannot get into, in growing cities, in a growing number of growing cities. Increasing use of the nighttime for socializing, entertainment, and labor as part of emerging new regimes of temporality became part of this new setting of urban life in the 16th century and later. And the rise of new forms of entertainment or performative arts, say Karagöz or the Meddah, which is of course a medieval form but took on a very new kind of life in the early modern era. This, as I said, is one of the earliest pictures of a coffee house ever, and I'll tell you its story in a minute. Let me begin by giving some highlights and some new findings regarding the early history of coffee and coffee houses. There must have been many instances when coffee was consumed as a plant found in the natural environment of Ethiopia and Yemen. But the earliest users who regularized its consumption as a social beverage, to the best of our knowledge, were Sufis in Yemen at the turn of the 15th century, circa 1400 or just before. And they were of the Shadili order, as I'm sure is well known to this audience. Evidently, they discovered that coffee gave them a certain nimbleness of the mind, that's how they phrase it, which they were keen on cultivating during their nighttime vigils and symposia. Thus started the long history of the appreciation of coffee as a companion to mental exercise and conviviality, which we all take for granted now, particularly when one wished to stretch or manipulate the biological and social clock. Sufis, in other words, well known for their colonizing roles in terms of settlement and construction in physical space, also played a pioneering role in colonizing the night and redesigning the architecture of the nocturnal and the diurnal. Nearly 3 centuries later, 3 centuries after the Shadilis in Yemen, countless regions and peoples between Yemen and Britain had come to recognize coffee as a household item, as a favorite stimulant to start and punctuate the day and night with, as a popular beverage that regularly lubricated myriad social occasions, and as the excuse for a widespread social institution, the coffee house, dedicated to leisure, chatter, and the politically charged formation and circulation of public culture. All this between 1400 and 1700, and by now, of course, any city you go to in the world, you probably ask, or you are not surprised if somebody asks, are there any coffee houses nearby? And I'm sure somebody will point you to 1 or 2 or 3 of them immediately. It's just a wonderfully successful invention in social history. I'll tell you more about it. All this we owe to a disciple of the Shadili Sheikh, I'm really thrilled to say, whose takia is just a few kilometers from where I now speak. I am particularly excited after all these years of working on coffee, lecturing on coffee, to be speaking right here where something very important was happening in this very global story. The basic contours of coffee's northward expansion are clear beyond Yemen, Beyond Yemen, coffee made its way slowly northwards to Hijaz. Of course, at the Hajj, it became something that millions of people became familiar with. And thereafter, it moved to the Arab cities of Egypt and the Levant. Early in the 16th century, we know coffee consumption in homes and outside in Damascus and in Cairo. And in the early 1500s, there were already coffee shops established in Cairo and Damascus. By the middle of that century, it was Istanbul's turn. By then, Istanbul had become the most populous city in the Western Hemisphere. Not so after the conquest in 1453, but by 1550, it had surpassed Cairo, it had surpassed Naples and various other cities of some scale. This is important because we're talking of consumption. The numbers of consumers is obviously very important when we're talking of a substance of popular consumption. The spatial evolution of the relevant establishments from coffee stall to coffee shop to coffee house needs to be investigated. I'm still not very clear on all of this, but it is only in the latter part, only after the middle of the 16th century, that we begin to have detailed information about coffee houses, institutions like this, covered spaces that brought together many people of different walks of life. And then by then we have verbal accounts in Arabic and Turkish, observations of European travelers, and visual renderings also start to come in before the end of the 16th century. Earliest mention found thus far of coffee in Istanbul itself, not of coffee houses yet, but of coffee, occurs in the endowment deed of Hayrettin Barbarossa, as Gülru was mentioning to some of you in a conversation earlier. This is a document that she discovered. When the Grand Admiral endowed some residences as part of the properties committed to the family waqf that he registered in 1539, the properties included several coffee chambers, kahve odası. There were namely chambers within the household of Barbarossa in 1539 in Istanbul that were dedicated to socializing around coffee. If Barbaros is indeed the pioneer of the use of coffee in the Ottoman capital, this would not be surprising, given his long seafaring career in and deep familiarity with North Africa and the Arab Mediterranean. Muradi, his biographer, writes, and I quote, "Sugary sherbets and musky coffee flowed like rivers in the banquets of his entourage." So clearly, Barbarossa was familiar with coffee already in the 1520s and 30s by his presence in North Africa, and eventually was one of the first to take coffee to be consumed then only in private environments before 1539 at some point. Still, the word kahwa, Bill's example should be in your minds. The word kahwa is given only in its ancient meaning of wine or alcoholic beverage in a comprehensive dictionary of Arabic into Ottoman Turkish that was completed in 1545. The lexicographer also gives the derivation of the word, based on his classical Arabic sources, from the root verb kahaya, and describes it as that which takes away or lessens the appetite for food. Perhaps the lexicographer knew about neo-kahwa, my kind of kahwa, I have to call for this occasion neo-kahwa, namely coffee as we now know it, but was not yet sure of its staying power. Even the exceptionally daring author of an Ottoman Esperanto, compiled in 1566, whose life as a Sufi between Cairo and Istanbul cannot but have familiarized him with the beverage, coins his own word for kahwa in his Esperanto dictionary. He gives you kahwa and then gives a counterpart in Esperanto, his Esperanto, which he also uses for wine in two other instances without any hints of a neo-kahwa, of a new usage. This is still 1560s, but the expansion of the realm of coffee, that is coffee as we now know it, was simply unstoppable by then. In all the instances we know something about, consumption started in private environments and then spilled over into public establishments, namely coffee houses. Private environments like homes or the Sufi orders. The most detailed and widely accepted account of the inaugural moment in Istanbul is provided by a 17th century historian, and he dates the first establishment to 1554-55, which we can now calibrate in the light of newer findings to 1551. But the most important thing here to note, and I will cite his very interesting passage to you, because it gives us the names of the first two entrepreneurs to whom I think we all owe one of the greatest social institutions of our lives. Constantinople, he says, or rather, until the year 962 of the Hijrah, in the high God-guarded city of Constantinople, as well as in Ottoman lands generally, coffee and coffee houses did not exist. He's slightly wrong maybe, but he's being an Istanbul chauvinist, so allow him. About that year, a fellow named Hakam from Aleppo and a wag called Shams from Damascus came to the city. They each opened a large shop in the district called Taht al-Qal'a, which is the district where all kinds of daily activity happened in great numbers. People of very many different classes came and hung out there for their daily shopping, and in the evening, usually lower classes continued to hang out there in cheap hostels, so to speak. So they each opened a large shop in the district called Taht al-Qal'a and began to purvey coffee. These shops became meeting places of a circle of pleasure seekers and idlers, and also of some wits from among the men of letters and literati, and they used to meet in groups of 20 or 30. Some read books. In the 20th and 21st century, coffee houses came to be associated with more lower class and related usages, and especially in the minds of modernizers, I know very well in the minds of Turkish modernizers, they became déclassé institutions one had to get rid of or marginalize. I'm just showing these to you also partly to indicate this is not at all the picture in the 16th century. These are places where wits, literati would come, read books. Some read books and fine writings. Some were busy with backgammon and chess. Some brought new poems and talked of literature. Those who used to spend a good deal of money on giving dinners for the sake of convivial entertainment found that they could attain the joys of conviviality merely by spending an asper or two, or a little coin or two. Namely, this is the democratization of conspicuous hospitality and patronage in everyday lives. Democratization in a very small sense, but still very important for me. And then he talks about the emergence of complaints and objections to coffee. The ulema said, "It is a house of evil deeds. It is better to go to the wine tavern than there." The imams, muezzins, and pious hypocrites said, "People have become addicts of coffee house. Nobody comes to the mosques." The preachers in particular made great efforts to forbid it. The muftis arguing that anything which is heated to the point of carbonization, that is, becomes charcoal, is unlawful, issued fatwas against it. In the time of Sultan Murad III, 1574 to 95, there were great interdictions and prohibitions. But certain persons made approaches to the chief of police and to the captain of the watch about selling coffee from back doors and side alleys, this is moonlighting, in small and unobtrusive shops, and were allowed to do this. After this time, it became so prevalent that the ban was abandoned. The preachers and muftis now said that it does not become completely carbonized, and to drink it is therefore lawful. Among the ulema, the sheikhs, the viziers, and the great, there was nobody left who did not drink. It even reached such a point that the grand viziers built great coffee houses themselves as investments and began to rent them out at 1 or 2 gold pieces a day. This is a brilliant depiction of so many different aspects of what was emerging, namely new and immensely popular forms of sociability, secularization of public space, again, secularization not in the currently charged political sense necessarily, but in its ultimately more important everyday sense, something that escaped the immediate control of certain types and concerns of the religious authority. Literary activity, tensions with the authorities, coffee as a commodity, and the coffee house as an investment. He touches upon all of these themes that are important parts of the story. In terms of the spread of coffee, Istanbul, as I said, being the most populous city, enjoyed these establishments from 1551 onwards, and by 1600, within half a century, in other words, there were more than 600 in Istanbul, and there were several thousand in different parts of the Ottoman Empire, again, beginning with Cairo and Damascus and Aleppo and major Arab cities, but also by then, by 1600, in all Balkan cities controlled by the Ottomans and beginning to move into spillover into Iran. Now, in 1582, there was this very famous public festivity in Istanbul which brought all the guilds to parade in the Hippodrome. Gülru showed on Tuesday, for those of you who were here listening to her lecture, the Ibrahim Pasha Palace, which is now the Turkish Islamic Arts Museum. In the Ibrahim Pasha Palace sat the Sultan as a guest and various dignitaries invited from different corners of the world to watch the festivities, the parades for 60 days. And here you see the florists walking, the obelisk, the famous memento of Roman, Byzantine, and later Ottoman Istanbul are here recognizable. So this I'm giving you just for a setting. In 1582, for the first time, a new guild took part in this parade. The Guild of Coffee House Owners. Put into this setting, here I'm giving it to you in enlarged format, just the particular detail, which is life-size. Namely, these are actual people sitting in the coffee shop, doing what they are doing, while poor apprentices, you see only 2 of them depicted, but there were actually more than a dozen, have to push the cart across the hippodrome for the parade of the Guild of Coffee Shop Owners. And here you see one of the earliest, again, scenes of, and this one, I think, in my opinion, really eats the cake, as they say. This is from Cairo. This is the Nile, and I associate coffee and the coffee house usages with so many things, but one of them is definitely with very inventive entrepreneurial activity. Imagine those 2 coffee merchants from Aleppo and Damascus, the ones I mentioned. Imagine, they're selling coffee in Istanbul. This is a big city, they're consuming a lot, and they hit upon the idea that if there's a coffee shop, and then others like it, they're of course going to be selling so much more of it. Here in Cairo, this picture is again from just before 1600, in a manuscript in the Topkapı Palace Library. You see a coffee house spread across 2 banks of the Nile, with people doing what one does in coffee shops. And here people going by the boat and having the drive-through experience. They buy their coffee. We have written records of this from the 17th century. They indeed bought their coffee from the coffee shop and took the coffee for a ride down the Nile and up the Nile. And one other thing, in that 17th century source which describes this place, it also says lovers across each other in different boats would send the coffee cups, which would float for a while at least, as messages. So you drink your coffee and then you send the cup across the water to the other boat where your beloved is supposed to get the message, so on and so forth. So this drive-through experience was created with various rituals eventually into something of a very memorable coffee house ever in this long history of coffee houses. And then the spread of coffee houses into Europe starts. The first incorporated coffee shop, incorporated establishment for the consumption, purveying of coffee is in Oxford. Of all places, a university town makes perfect sense, and it is in that city, Oxford, a coffee society was established in the 1650s to which Sir Isaac Newton belonged, because I guess he loved the idea of the nimbleness of the mind at night time. Don't we know it all, those who do all kinds of studying at night? This picture is from the 1650s, late 1650s in London, one of the earliest, again, in Europe. Again, there is something I want to note here. It's an all-male establishment. I will come to this point about coffee houses. All the pictures I'm showing you, you must have recognized, except for the one in Cairo, excuse me. Except for the one in Cairo, but that is, of course, in open air with all kinds of different settings, including the water. But in closed spaces that I've shown you, it was an all-male activity until the 19th century, mostly in most parts of the world, by the way. including London here, as you see, except for the innkeeper's wife or daughter that is part of the setting. Much more to say about this, but I will want to continue to the recognition in Europe after the beginning of the consumption of coffee. For a century or so, Europeans observed coffee during their travels in the Ottoman, Turkish, or Arab world, mostly. And they write about it, sometimes physician travelers speaking about the medicinal qualities of coffee. And some of them individually took coffee back to different places in Europe where they experimented with it. But once it caught on as a social institution, people realized that it had something to do with a broader phenomenon of the early modern world, namely tea and chocolate consumption as well. If you look at these three, here you see a Turk consuming coffee, a Chinaman consuming tea, and an Indian consuming chocolate. These three substances, the author of this book realized, were fluids, social beverages that had conquered the globe by the middle of the 17th century. At that moment, it wouldn't all be coffee houses, but you could really go from Edo, later Tokyo, of course, or Beijing, or Delhi, or different cities of the Ottoman world to Europe and to the New World. In the 1690s, there was one in Boston, to the New World, and find either coffee or tea or chocolate as something of a social beverage that gives you a pick-me-up, among other things. I won't take too much more of your time. I think the spread of coffee is very clear in this story from Yemen to London, and the role of North Africa with two very important aspects, each of which actually need to be studied further, at least for me. Namely, I'm very delighted to meet today a colleague who has studied and found some very important documents on early history of coffee houses in Tunisia. But with respect to both the consumption of coffee in Tunisia, but with respect to also the role of the Shadili dervishes and eventually other dervishes, and how they interpreted the use of coffee as a beverage of particular uses for them, the mental states that people associated with it, especially through the categories of Galenic medicine at that time. It's a long story, but coffee was associated with dryness. And hence, for instance, in Galenic medicine, it was okay for women to drink lots of it because women had a wet temperament anyway, and that dryness does not really cause an ill effect so much. But if men who already have a drying kind of temperament were to have a good deal of coffee, that would make them lose various qualities. So, for instance, in 1675, in London, Galenic medicine also was not just part of the ancient world or the Islamic world, it was also a European phenomenon. In 1675, in London, there's a very famous petition. It's called Against Coffee, and it says, Women's Petition Against Coffee, that drying, enfeebling liquor that takes our men away. So coffee had these kinds of associations, which I don't have time to develop, and I'd love to see more of what Sufis had to say on this, how the sailors' environment in the early 16th century were consuming it, people like Barbarossa before they took it to other parts of the world, etc., etc. But once they were established, coffee houses undoubtedly fell on fertile ground and turned out to be famously user-friendly for those urbanites, for that new kind of urban life that I invoked in the beginning, who constituted the clientele. Now, Mustafa Ali, a famous Ottoman author who died in 1600, experienced throughout his life this moment of growth, proliferation, popularization of coffee. Mustafa Ali, bureaucrat, intellectual, prolific author, and a snobby gadfly, did not think highly of most of those clients of coffee houses. Ever an acute observer of the social scene, and possibly even a connoisseur of the beverage himself, Ali is the first to refer to speed, surat, surat. as one of the qualities of coffee and as the desire of the dervishes and of the people of learning who went to such places. Namely, they want to quickly acquire that mental state which would give them perky conversation and engagement with ideas, etc., etc. But the city boys, the soldiers, and the simple folk who spent time there in coffee houses for no reason but gossip, promotion, and wasting time, he found them particularly troubling. He found it particularly disturbing that such riffraff could engage in ostentatious hospitality, the way I described it a few minutes ago from the mouth of a 17th century historian, from the pen of a 17th. He found it disturbing that such riffraff could engage in ostentatious hospitality by, and I quote, treating each other to a cup of coffee, of impressing their friends with 1 cup of something, 4 cups of which costs 1 little coin. Ever keen on social mobility as one of the signs of disorder that beset Ottoman society in his time, Ali was clearly disturbed by what I have called that small d democratizing impact of coffee houses on social life. Small wonder that by the end of the 16th century there were hundreds of coffee houses in Istanbul, as I mentioned, and thousands spread across the empire. The inhabitants of several cities could choose among dozens. Even the small town of Safed in the Galilee, one of the few majority Jewish towns in the Ottoman world, could boast of some coffee houses which were open at night, and that really bothered the rabbi. As revealed by controversial issues raised in front of the rabbis, Jewish poets were composing Hebrew lyrics to Turkish songs that the clients were not inhibited from singing their hearts out. They were singing Turkish songs, so in order to stop that, songs achieve popularity in such spaces and circulate quite easily, even if you don't know the language well, right? I remember learning so many English songs before I really learned English. This happened. So they were learning and singing Turkish songs and doing this at night, which is particularly problematic from the points of authorities, religious or otherwise, most of the time. And so they decided that they would patronize a famous poet to compose Hebrew lyrics to those songs so that they would at least sing them in Hebrew instead of singing them in Turkish. The story is interesting for various reasons, but to me, obviously, it indicates how the popularity of coffee and coffee houses spread across ethnic and religious boundaries. Bigger coffee houses were established eventually. Some in cities like Cairo or Istanbul, you would find small neighborhood establishments, maybe limited to one neighborhood or to one social segment, but you also had these grand ones, which usually made use of vistas. In Istanbul particularly, coffee houses turned to manzara, as one says in Turkish Arabic, to vistas. This is from the 18th century in the Pera section of the city, but the clientele is mostly Muslim you can tell from the dress. This one is but this too, at the sailors' part of the city, near Tophane, near the cannon foundry, as if one knows the city today, there are a good many poems written about this coffee shop, and it says, as you would expect in a sailor's environment, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Italians, and many others frequented it. And Act 2 has its own perspective and concern with view. This is one of my favorite ones, actually, for an Istanbul view, but no time to dwell on it. This is one of the most handsome establishments ever built of a coffee house, endowed by Hassan Pasha in Aleppo in the beginning of the 17th century. This is the plan. It's a stone building that remained until recently, and I don't want to even think what may have happened to it. It is a handsome facade, of which I don't have a good picture. And the plan here, we were speaking with Siham, is because we visited Mrabit together, it was my first walk into Mrabit, the plan here is not unlike, it's the same idea of one big common space, but able to create under domes or through pillars, able to create separations for small groups of 3 or 4 or 5 to feel part of the larger community while at the same time having some privacy. In the absence of tables, especially dinner tables, this is a great way to handle this problem. Private uses of coffee, tobacco and coffee. Tobacco came into the same scene after a certain point, and the two went so well together. Please excuse my language, but we are all adults here. There's a brilliant Arabic poem composed about coffee and tobacco. It goes, "Ad-duhan bila kahwa, kal-jima' bila shahwa." Well, women and coffee houses. Lady Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, a very learned lady and one of the blue stockings, one of the earliest blue stockings. This is 1710, 1715, thereabouts. She realized that women were just as interested in socializing around coffee. But because coffee houses were male establishments, to them, she said, this happened in bathhouses. Bathhouses, she writes, are coffee houses of women. And it's a very social scene. Sorry? Hammam, yes. And in homes, of course, in private parties, etc., but also in social environments like a bathhouse, coffee became quickly a part to the degree gender arrangements in that society made it possible. A male bathhouse, again, a social scene to show how social these environments were. In other words, coffee houses fell onto fertile ground, as I said, in these new urban formations. And they were part of a growing number of different kinds of public spaces, some ancient, some new, but either qualitatively or quantitatively new and growing number of public spaces that now became part of city lives. Compared to, say, 1400, in 1700, as measured by André Raymond, there was much more bathhouse space in Cairo, much more. The progression is really geometric. Bathhouse is not a new institution, but other types of institutions, like coffee houses, were creating these environments for a new kind of social life, such as markets, obviously, growing numbers, closed markets, like this is the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, or open-air markets, Sufi lodges. After 1500, any city now is going to have, any large city is going to have hundreds of them belonging to more than a dozen different orders. Sufi, this is the one in Galata, the famous Mevlevi Lodge, the whirling dervishes. Again, with a view, if you note, it's part of that same concern. Even small neighborhood fountain piazzas created around neighborhood fountains, and the number of fountains in Cairo and Istanbul, again, the two cities I know better in terms of their research done on them, the progression is geometric of the number of neighborhood fountains from, say, 1500 to 1800. So such social space, coffee houses are part of this environment. Public transportation, which brings, again, people together, promenades and picnics in the 18th century in particular, but already beginning in the 17th, and coffee houses as places of political debate. Here you see an engaged discussion of the front, of the war, of the Russian front in the early 19th century. I guess my point is by and large made, and I just want to say a few words about accompanying uses of the nighttime, which I have called in some writings the conquest of the night. Some people are lately speaking of the loss of the night because of lighting pollution and stuff like that. But that's a late 20th, early 21st century phenomenon, the loss of the night. But in the early modern era, the phenomenon can be better described as moving into the night for, if you think of the night as a site, moving into the night to engage in several types of activities for entertainment, socializing, and labor. And that was happening, conquest or colonization, beginning with new techniques and new styles of lighting. This kind of lighting between the minarets, for instance, we know was created in the 1570s or 60s maybe. And it does take its inspiration from some nightly practices, in my opinion, that had started a bit earlier in Cairo, to spend the whole night around the mosque together at certain festive nights of the year. This is a kind of research I have done and published elsewhere, and I'm continuing to do, but I just want to indicate to you how the research and the work on coffee connects temporally, but also thematically and analytically with that process of changing rhythms of day and night, changing uses made of the nighttime, etc., etc. Now, also nighttime festivities. There were always nighttime festivities, especially in a city like Cairo, but many other cities adopted, and many more occasions were found to have well-lit nighttime occasions. Circumcision of a prince. This one looks grand because it's an imperial one. But there could be other holy nights of the year, Ramadan nights, of course, where coffee houses had lanterns and invited people. Karagöz performances were taking place every night during the Ramadan in any of these major cities, sometimes separated by a curtain. Women, those were the few occasions when women could become coffee house customers because they took also their children to watch performances, something like a popular theater of an early modern sort. In any case, so these public festivities started also to take more of the nighttime and in more measured ways. So for instance, in the earlier nighttime events, one reads, we had fun until the wee hours of the morning. Imprecise. Beginning with the famous festivities of 1675, these festivities started to acquire schedules. You know, at 2 p.m., I'm making up the numbers, at 2 p.m. begin the acrobats. After 1 hour, they stop, there's a half-hour break, and then come the Karagöz puppet show. Da, 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 da. It really acquires, especially in the 18th century, it becomes a much more charted, navigated, scheduled site when we're speaking of the night. Now, to conclude, just keep this picture in front of us and in our minds, or this one from, again, a nighttime festivity. The introduction of coffee, in other words, brought with it, beyond the mere availability of the stimulus, the emergence of a new perception of the night in which the hours of darkness could be shaped and manipulated by human initiative rather than condemn man to passive repose. But playing with the architecture of the nighttime naturally meant adjustments for the morning as well, as we all know. Sometime before 1581, a professor at one of Bursa's respected madrasas saw himself in a dream, crying his heart out while making preparations for his father's burial. This is his dream. He's a madrasa professor, his father is dead, he's making preparations for the burial. Upon awakening in a state of trepidation, he knew he needed a reliable dream analyst and was led by friends to a renowned Sufi, Sheikh Üftade Efendi. Anyone who knows Bursa knows Üftade Efendi. The saintly man knew exactly why the young scholar had been visited by that disturbing dream. He must have missed the morning prayer. For that, the Sheikh said, is the most powerful of all ritual prayers, just as there is no being closer to and more powerful for a son than a father. He was right. Üftade's hagiographer, who related this anecdote, happened to be the guilt-ridden professor's son, for whom the interface between one's faith and filial piety must have served an additional lesson. He was in a good position to not only certify the truthfulness of the Sheikh's interpretation, but also to offer his father's explanation. He had heard from his father why he had missed the morning prayer. The father said, or the son said, that his father had been to a show on the night before and could not wake up in the morning. Worse than the disorientation of waking up is the trauma of waking up late. Even worse, when millions evidently voted with their lips during the last half millennium of human history. Even worse is not having the assistance of some substance like coffee or tea to reorient us, to warm us up, to give us a buzz. These these millions of people in the last half millennium knew that that was needed if you're going to play around with your nighttime activities. The day ahead was likely to be busier than days used to be, and the night before certainly offered more diversion than nights used to. That is why even Mustafa Ali, that snob, the gadfly I quoted before, that is why even Mustafa Ali approved of certain uses of coffee houses. And I quote, "Early rising worshippers and pious men get up and go there, drink a cup of coffee, adding life to their life. They feel, in a way, that its slight exhilaration strengthens them for their religious observance and worship. From that point of view, coffee houses are commended and praised." Thank you all very much. Please.
Je vous remercie beaucoup pour cette très belle conférence, très agréable. Vous avez dit des choses vraiment en attente. Je me demande personnellement si la qahwa chadliya n'est pas plus ancienne et pas nécessairement liée au derviche. Parce que nous avons une confrérie Chadli. Chadli est parti d'ici.
Oui.
Il est parti d'ici au XIIIe siècle et dans des conditions assez difficiles. Bon. Et on a commencé par parler de Chadli. Jusqu'à présent, le café qu'on prend, qui s'appelle turc chez vous, arabe chez nous, c'est le même.
Grec à Grèce.
Grec en Grèce. On l'appelle encore Chadli. Donc, à mon avis, il est plus ancien. C'est-à-dire qu'il a commencé, d'ailleurs, on l'appelait aussi Qahwat Fuqara. C'est le café Sufi. Hein? Et je pense que
Qu'en pensez-vous?
Depuis le XIVe siècle, au moins. Parce que il y a deux choses qui ont circulé chez les soufis, en tout cas on a accusé les soufis de ça, c'est le hashish, pour passer toute la nuit en dhikr, et le café. Voilà. Mais autrement, adoré vos photos.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Just a question.
Please.
Are there reports about the spaces being also political spaces where
Yes.
the political exchange?
Yes, yes, a good deal. I skipped those parts, but in fact, I started working on coffee houses because of their significance as political spaces. I was working on a series of rebellions in Istanbul from 1589 to 1730. There are 12 spectacular revolts with sometimes bloody consequences, but definitely always with very severe political consequences, usually called Janissary rebellions in Ottoman history, but the social composition is more complicated than that. In any case, I started to be interested in coffee houses because I noticed 1589 is the first of the revolts. Remember the dates I showed you. Because I noticed that as soon as coffee houses were becoming popular, they started to serve, among other things, as places of political gossip, mobilization, organization, propaganda. certain new genres were created of oral poetry that circulated very easily, like today's social media. So authors, Selanik'i, another author of the late 16th century, who witnessed these developments in Istanbul, writes about some of these. He says, mumbling started among the people, and they coined the following chronogram, tarih, in the sense of a chronogram, and they could be very easy devices to, like memes today. Is that the word? Am I right? Memes? Things that quickly become recognizable, iconic, and circulate in the social media. Just like that. So, for instance, there was a monetary crisis in the 1580s, which ultimately led to a big debasement and devaluation in 1586 and a rebellion in 1589. The vizier in charge of the monetary reforms was taking certain measures that were totally unpopular with the coffee house clients, including the soldiers. And they coined the phrase bid'at-ı kabihe, to say it in it's all Arabic, of course, bid'a kabiha, but bid'at-ı kabihe. And this translates into the year of, as a chronogram, into the year of the monetary reform. Selanik'i writes that this phrase moved all around the city from coffee house clientele to coffee house clientele to express a shared critique. And 3 years later, the reforms continued, other coinages were in the meantime created, and the rebellion took place, and the vizier lost his reforms and his life. So, this is just one example, but yes, coffee houses were banned again and again, and I have some examples here, but I don't want to waste your time. The example I wanted to give is from the 1630s, at the time of Murad IV, who was very harsh on coffee houses in particular. He banned coffee houses for several years. I read recently in a manuscript, in a popular manuscript of the time, he banned women to go in their own neighborhood from house to house. The author says he couldn't manage to keep that ban. But he did try that too. He was really, very dictatorial, even for the standards of the time. Sultan, I need not go into that. But so Murad IV time, there was a very harsh, severe ban on coffee houses. Some people in the countryside opened one or two. So there's a report I found in the archives in which somebody says coffee houses opened in our neighborhood or in our small town despite the ban, and people gather there and talk about politics. The response from Istanbul comes a few weeks or days thereafter and says, you should make sure, just as I said in my ban, that people do not congregate, period, in the coffee houses or elsewhere. Yes. So these are some examples of the kind of thing that happened in Europe too, of course. Coffee houses became political spaces and were led to various bans and closings.
En Tunis, il y avait ce qu'on appelle café chanta.
Ah,
Café chanta, c'était des endroits marginaux, où bon, tout le monde ne pouvait pas aller dans ces endroits. Et il y en avait surtout dans le quartier populaire de Bab Souaïra, à Tunis. Et justement, où il y avait le café, la musique, les femmes, des femmes qui dansaient, etc., qui chantaient. Et c'était des lieux, effectivement, un peu dont on parlait, mais quoi, que seuls quelques adultes fréquentaient. Et puis, sous les remparts de la Médina, il y a quand même un groupe très important d'écrivain. تحت السور, c'est bien là. Hein?
تحت السوق.
تحت السور.
تحت السوق, تحت القلعة. Yeah.
C'est la même chose, j'y ai pensé quand vous parlez de تحت القلعة, تحت السور. Et c'est un groupe d'écrivains qui étaient très mal vus de la société, mais qui sont des grands écrivains. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for a great lecture. And I'm Neapolitan. And as such, like I was born and raised in the midst of coffee. And actually, I have two questions for you. One for you as an historian, and one for you as a coffee lover. The one as an historian, one of the first books I read when I started my university, my degree in international relations in Naples was Fitna, written by Gilles Capet. And in the first chapter, there is this story about the birth of croissant and cappuccino. Now, because when I teach now my classes as a I teach in Brussels, I use normally a picture of a cappuccino monk and a croissant to start from the failed siege of Yemen. I would like to know from you how, whether this is just a legend or there is some truth in it about how in Europe we started drinking cappuccino and why we started using it with croissant. And the second question as a coffee lover, coming from Naples, I never, as I said, I was raised in this myth of coffee. When I moved to London for my PhD, the first time I went into a coffee place and I asked for a coffee, they asked me which one, espresso, double. I was like, how many you know? There is just espresso. They were looking at me like if I were an alien. I never understood why Naples became such a center in Europe for coffee lovers with this. When you show the mocha as a Neapolitan, I was like, this is not Italian, this is Neapolitan. So I never understood.
Good, I'm glad. Now that I learned
see
this.
why we how we ended up inventing pizza. I can see why we ended up like producing pasta in a certain way, but I never understood why Naples became so let's say obsessed with coffee. And for us it's a huge cultural thing. I mess up a lot with my friends from outside Naples when they bring me to coffee places in Rome or Milan. This is dirty water, don't like bother me with this stuff. So as a coffee lover, I would like to ask you if you have any idea of why like Naples became such a big place in Western Europe for the consumption of coffee.
The first question was about Vienna. Yes. No, it's such a good fable. I'm afraid I have to. I feel very sorry to say it's not true. For all I know, I heard it too, and maybe we should just keep it, no matter what its accuracy, because it is such a nice. It is so well put together as a story. But really, later research has shown already in the 1660s, Ottoman Armenian merchants took coffee to Vienna, opened a coffee house in Vienna. And I don't know, of course, if they were serving cappuccino, what specific make it was, but, excuse me? Chocolate in Vienna, of course. But also the cafe in Vienna are very big. So this Armenian had started long before the second siege of Vienna, the failed siege of Vienna. As for the shape of croissant, I cannot be sure. The story just does not work in terms of the introduction of coffee to Vienna. Otherwise, the specific objects or shapes can be, but I haven't seen any, I have to be pedantic about this, sorry. I haven't seen any convincing evidence as a historian that that's really the way it took place. And in fact, there's that counter evidence that it had already started earlier, at least indirectly. In terms of its move into Italy in general, I know, Naples is very special. I understand and I really respect that. loved it myself. And but in terms of the travel of coffee to Italy, we know of two very early instances. One is Pietro della Valle of Rome taking some coffee with him after his travels, and the other is the Jewish clients in Safed, whom I mentioned, were part of a neo-Kabbalistic sect, Lurianism. And it was particularly keen on using the nighttime for their vigils. And they eventually spread over into Verona and certain northern Italian cities, again in the early 17th century. This has been studied by Elliot Horowitz. And they took coffee from areas around the Levant to northern Italy. It's again 1610, 1615 or so. But these are only private uses, not with coffee house yet. As for Naples, I don't know the answer to your question, but to me it makes such good sense, because I remember reading that the British, when they sent their ambassadors to the Orient, they would station them in Naples for a while so that they would acclimatize. You know what? They would stay in Naples for 2-3 months and then move to Cairo.
When I introduce myself here in Tunis, I always say that أنا من شمال المغرب.
No, I wish I knew otherwise, but Naples is a special place. I wish I knew more about it.
J'ai lu dans Khalil Ibn Al-Jid qu'à Istanbul, les gens ne sortaient pas après la prière du soir.
Du soir.
Et donc comment on fait pour les cafés? Comment font les gens pour passer la nuit? Vous avez dit que les gens allaient dans les cafés le soir. Est-ce que... Comment ils font? C'est-à-dire à partir... C'est-à-dire exceptionnel du Ramadan, les gens pouvaient sortir le soir, mais le restant de l'année, c'était obligé de rester chez eux.
I'm afraid it's... Inalcik is a great historian and one of our masters, and I know he's always on good grounds, but on this I don't agree. People did go out at night. There were bans. There were times when the bans were applied more strictly, sometimes not. Many times, though, there were no bans, really. You also read in many stories. First of all, coffee houses at night, also overnight, in other words, after the regular function of the coffee house and the performances, say, of Karagöz or whatever, the coffee houses also served as hostels, as inns, for the growing number of so-called bachelors, bekar evleri, young men, migrant workers who come to the city for work. Thousands of them from Albania, from Kurdistan, from different parts, coming to the city for various reasons. And we read both in police records, but also in popular tales, which I studied, that many of them stayed in coffee houses because the bekar odaları, these establishments, bachelors' inns, were not sufficient in numbers. So they find many boatmen, for instance, if they've committed a crime, police look for them in coffee houses at night time. But obviously this also triggered various authorities to apply pressures and bans and make it impossible, or make rules like, if you go out at night, you have to have a lantern with you so that the police can recognize you. This rule was there in different moments in the 18th and 19th centuries, so that you couldn't go incognito, right, at night. You couldn't go incognito. You would have to have a lantern. That's the rule they passed. And in one of the Karagöz plays, they make fun of this with the following story. Karagöz takes a lantern, goes out at night, but he doesn't light the lantern. So the police catches him and they say, you've disobeyed. He says, no, I have my lantern. Nobody said that it has to be lit in the firma. So people, I'm sure, played with these kinds of things, even at times of bans.
Thank you very much for making a very well-articulated and well-supported argument for the connection between modernity especially in regards to the quickening of tempo, expansion of public spaces, democratization of social life, and this is really fascinating. But I was just wondering also if there is another story or other evidence for the connection or association of coffee with a certain anti-modernity, with forces that hold back modernity, especially just thinking about coffee houses today in the Arab world, in Tunisia, just seeing all these people who have been, mainly youth who are unemployed, not that they don't want to work, but that they're forced to be unemployed, to take full account of what is going on in Tunisia. So it seems like it's a place where people just hang out and wait, quote unquote, waste time. Of course, there's a lot going on there. But, I mean, it's a place for networking even today. So I just wonder, going back to the period, just thinking about what's going on today and thinking about the period that you're doing work, historical work in that period of the Ottoman Empire, I just wonder if there's any evidence of similar concerns, especially that you also mentioned the idea of labor. And this is an early modern period where there's also the rise of industrialization. So were there any concerns about the coffee houses being a place that is, and the coffee itself that is holding back the march towards modernity, especially with these bans, and labor in terms of idle labor that is lingering and doing nothing?
Thank you. That's a really great question. In the 19th and 20th centuries, definitely. That's why I mentioned how the modernizers were opposed, actually, to coffee houses, or at least considered them unworthy institutions. With the modern history of Turkish politics, there are dozens of examples of this. Also in literature, there are dozens of examples of this. When we were growing up, it's also from personal lives that we knew of coffee houses as places where, old-fashioned people, old-fashioned types, the idle types, people who weren't really with it in terms of having caught up with modernity. Those types of people would hang out in coffee houses. This is quite common, a perception of coffee houses in the late 19th and 20th centuries among modernizers, political elites, writers, etc. You don't get much of that in the earlier centuries, in the early modern era. You do, of course, you do read about people wasting time, or jobless folks hanging out there, but that's really not in itself anything anti-modern. It's just that they have been unable to have a job, have a position, or that they have been fired from their positions. We also read that many scholars and academics and young students would hang out in coffee houses if their careers weren't going well, if they were fired from their positions, and things of that sort. And that in itself doesn't say anything about modern or non-modern, obviously, but one of the aspects of coffee houses looking like institutions that would prevent certain demands of modernity from the point of view of modernizers and perhaps even others, was that they were so strictly gender-based institutions that men would hang out there. So again, if I'm thinking of 20th century politics and literature in the environments I know something about, it looked non-modern, if not anti-modern, that these coffee houses were places where men went and socialized with other men, that you couldn't take your female friends to the coffee houses. That in itself, from the point of view of 20th century modernization, looks backward, of course. Right? When the idea of men and women going to social spaces together became part of a new set of values associated with modernity, coffee houses lost a good deal of the earlier elan that I was speaking about. So on and so forth. One could multiply these examples. I mean, it's a great question. No institution, obviously, is of one nature throughout these long centuries. And even in one century, I'm sure it's going to give you different kinds of. But coffee as such, to separate your question into two parts, coffee houses and coffee. Coffee as such, I don't know if coffee as such acquired the quality or the reputation of being something anti-modern. Coffee houses may have, but coffee, I don't know, one has to see, I would have to think more about the substance itself. At least the fact that it gives you a buzz was always recognized, that it was something that gives you perk, that gives you active energy.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was going to say that there's no secret that there's a tendency for some to consume substances, be it addictive substances. Why is it, in your opinion, that I suppose coffee has been more socially acceptable historically and in these present times?
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting question.
Very interesting question again. Oh, something I could have shown you. Note the coffee cups. This is a private party of the ladies, musicians, dancers, etc., and socializers, let's say, and they have coffee cups in their hands, of course. But I'm with your question. This is a tavern scene from an 18th century manuscript, illuminated manuscript. This guy is Muslim. The musicians and entertainers and the tavern keeper are Greek. I know the story. I don't have time to go over it. And he's wasting his father's money. That's the short of it. Another scene from a tavern. Yeah, this is better. Where you have a conversation between the more pious Sufi and the more wild calendar type Sufi who drinks, and the two speak about the mutual advantages and disadvantages of their choices, to put it in the most neutral manner. The tavern, you have literature about this from already the age of early coffee houses in Europe, say 17th century in London. Coffee houses were associated, and coffee was associated with sobriety compared to, even if it led to some kind of addiction, at some level, it was mild addiction, people considered. And after people became familiar with it, at first there were more doubts about its intoxicating qualities. But after people became familiar with it, it was associated with sobriety. So in England or in the Ottoman Empire, you have in English or Turkish authors writing that, you know, people go to coffee houses and spend a lot of time because they can keep sober and chat for hours. Whereas in the tavern, obviously the effect of alcohol will work differently. And the tavern keepers, by the way, complained. There are also, in the old-fashioned style of munazara, the debate between this and that, the old Arabic tradition, then copied in later Ottoman literature, you have debates between coffee and wine, in which these ideas are expressed. Wine says, I'm much better than you because I do this, that, and the other. And coffee says, no, no, no. And it's always about sobriety versus intoxication. And the addicting quality, though, was realized also early on in the framework of Galenic medicine and considered mild. At first, but before people were really familiar with it, though, there were anxieties. People were scared. There is this wonderful experiment conducted in Cairo in front of the Qadi in the 1520s, I believe, or teens. So one person sees that the neighboring family is consuming coffee, and a good deal of it. So he goes to the Qadi and says, my neighbors are drinking kahwa. Kahwa has that earlier connotation. My neighbors are drinking coffee. And the judge, though, cannot make up his mind on the basis of this much, And he invites the coffee drinkers to the court and makes them drink. After they drink several cups of coffee, he decides in their favor. He says, no, they're not intoxicated. They may be wired, but... Sorry. Bill, I think you had a question.
No, my question is along the same line, where the gender differentiation would negate the modern. I'm wondering the social stratification. Do we have any idea of how much coffee costs? Is it accessible to poor people? Because a lot of the pictures that we see and a lot of the anecdotes that we read, coffee seems to be the beverage of professionals, educated elite, religious leaders, things of that nature. So I'm just wondering if we know, we have any primary sources that talk about pricing.
Prices were pretty good as in those instances, as I mentioned, where a simple person could go to the coffee house. There are many other instances, some of them reported by European travelers who were surprised at the scene when a poor person, not poor person, but somebody of the lower middle classes, let's say, goes to the coffee house and says, all drinks on me. Jabba is the word. Jabba. This is repeated in some Italian sources. It's on me, and thus they suddenly become, for a moment, patron of the neighborhood. Like prices in general of coffee were pretty good. What made it more complicated is sugar, and they drank coffee without sugar for a long, long while. But in the early 18th century, the French in the Caribbean and the Dutch in Java, in their colonies, acclimatized Arabica beans, which is the decline of mocha and Yemeni trade, of course. I mean, there are pictures of Yemen after this point in late 18th century. It's really falling apart. All these earlier caravanserai type buildings, inns, khans. What's the local version of khans? Funduk. Funduks are falling apart, crumbling. But up until the early 18th century, Yemen mocha was flourishing, especially as the port. Then the coffee coming from the European colonies was bitter. And people started using it with sugar. And that complicates the picture because sugar was not so cheap, not so inexpensive. And I'm sure poor people continued to drink it without sugar, etc. But the cost has to be factored in, at least at certain points. Please.
Thank you so much. I'll just ask a very quick question. I've read in some secondary sources about early 20th century Tunisia that the first modern coffee shop was Café Etudes downtown.
Café?
Café Etudes, like Café Etudes, yeah.
Downtown.
And other people would probably know a lot more about this than I do, but that the distinguishing feature of this so-called modern cafe or coffee shop was that there were tables provided with chairs and also paper provided so that letters could be written. So I wonder if you can talk about just the shifts that we see from people sitting on the ground, with tables kind of scattered in between them, to these higher tables with chairs that facilitate writing.
Very, very good question. About the use of space, I'm also wondering about. So we see some little stools and things used in these pictures, Laura, right? The old-fashioned type of divan. This is from London, high table, private table. I want to get to this, which is unusual. It's a chair, which one does get to see more of eventually. But here, obviously, there were a few people using chairs in the coffee shop in this very early picture. Otherwise, I think it's a great, big difference to introduce tables and seating arrangements of that sort. That really is a much later thing and introduces. Even the architect, the spatial organization, as I've shown you, has something to do with the with the absence of tables, which would have given you maybe distinct seating arrangements without, but I'm glad that it didn't happen that way, because Mrabit wouldn't look like Mrabit, and the Hasan Pasha one in Aleppo wouldn't look like the Hasan Pasha one in Aleppo. In any case, whatever one thinks of that oneself, these places were relatively free, other than a low-lying communal seat like a divan, were relatively free of such furnitures. And it must be a big difference.
I'd like to talk about the ban on coffee shops. We owe in Tunisia a similar ban, sweet drink for Ramadan, called Bouza.
Bouza.
Which we owe to the Ottomans. And I read somewhere that originally it was an alcoholic drink, a sort of beer. And a similar ban was made on the Bouza shops. And the people who were working there, losing their livelihoods, transformed it into a sweet drink. That's how we inherited.
It just happens, I found an example I was looking for earlier, which has to do with Bouza. You hit the right spot here. Yes, Bouza can acquire a level of fermentation which gives it a certain alcohol-like quality, or alcohol quality. It's a very low percentage, I hear, but with beer too, depends on the quantity, right? After all, it's usually 4% or 5% of a bottle, but if one consumes a lot, it can also get you intoxicated. With Bouza too, it was possible, certainly. They were quite popular in the 15th century in Bursa, for instance. A student of mine has written on them. And even then, it had both the alcoholic and today's type of non-alcoholic, like maybe non-alcoholic beer. You had two kinds of Bouza in Bursa in the 15th century. But let me read you this source from again, just around 1600, when most of my examples were placed. This is a letter from Koja Sinan Pasha, who was also in charge of the army that went to Yemen in that period. And he's Grand Vizier at this moment, and the Sultan sends him an order. This is his response. He received an order from the Sultan in which he was asked to enforce a ban on some spaces of public sociability. 3 types of establishments are mentioned, with the word khane, khana in Persian meaning house. So he says, meyhanes, houses of wine, bozahanes, houses of boza, and kahvehanes, coffee houses. This is the way the vizier responds. You ordered, he says to the Sultan, you ordered that taverns, boza houses, and coffee houses should be banned. I shall look into it. You ordered that coffee houses too should be banned. Fine with me. I have never been inside a coffee house. But these people need a place for rest and relaxation, or they will eat each other's flesh. So he points out that the coffee house is something special among these different types of establishments. Boza and tavern, they can go. They have also the problem of containing some alcohol, but coffee houses, they will eat each other's flesh.
Beautiful image to end with.
Bill.
See you all at the coffee house soon. Okay. Thank you, Professor Kafadar. This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Please join us for some kahwa.
Old-fashioned kahwa.